Hi, everyone. Welcome to the How to Fish podcast by Tailored Tackle. I am Ed Hitchcock. I'm your host. I'm the owner of Tailored Tackle. And today we are talking about live bait. Now, we are going to be talking about live bait in terms of a freshwater sense. I know I've brought this up a couple times, but I'm going to have totally separate saltwater podcasts. They're just kind of a world apart. And I know that the majority of you listening are interested in freshwater fishing. So we're going to get started with that. And then I'm going to start sprinkling in saltwater episodes. So what are we covering today? We are covering the different types of live bait and how to present them, and me pushing you as a beginner to use live bait in the beginning. So I know we covered lures, and we covered some other things here last week with beginner, advanced, and expert. This is a beginner level episode, but really it's an everybody episode, because I truly believe that live bait is your first line of attack when it comes to getting on fish in the majority of cases. Now, largemouth bass are a little bit tricky in that regards, but pretty much everything else in freshwater, if you want to get on fish and just catch a handful of fish and you're not worried about the specific size or the specific species, I think that live bait is a really, really good way to go. And so why do I think that? Why would I recommend live bait over artificial bait? Artificial bait is trying to recreate live bait, and it allows you to present it in a myriad of fashions and techniques and tactics that you can't do with live bait, but at the end of the day, it's trying to mimic live bait. And so, yes, you have a bunch of positives where you can increase your speed, increase your efficiency, like create situations that you couldn't with live bait. But at the end of the day, you're really trying to recreate something that is alive. And so it would be much easier and more effective as a beginner to get started just using the live bait that all of the artificials are trying to create. And so we always sell both, right? When you buy our kits, we sell a bunch of rigs to do the live bait, and we also sell a lot of artificial lures. There's a time and place for every single thing in these kits, but I want you to keep in mind that you should probably default to live bait in the beginning, and you will catch more fish. You might not catch the fish you want. You might not catch the biggest fish. It might not be the right species, but you're going to get on fish. That's the beauty of live bait. So let's get started talking about the types of live bait. So you have worms, minnows, leeches, insects. We're going to kind of stick away from those. I mean, crickets and stuff like that. It's just a little too complicated. So worms, minnows, leeches, and that's what we're going to kind of focus on today. I know that might get confusing when you think about like other types of artificial bait that's kind of like a live bait, such as like power bait or those gulp things. That's going to be a separate podcast. So we're just talking about things that are alive when you're throwing them in the water, and sometimes they die on you and you're throwing them in the water anyways, but live bait. So worms, minnows, and leeches. And each of these has its pros and cons and use cases. I highly recommend, just like when we did the beginner on like how to catch a fish today, I highly recommend, if you're just going out there for the first time, to get some worms, throw them under a clip bobber and get them out there, and you're probably going to catch some panfish. So if you already caught your first fish on a worm, let's start breaking down the different types of live bait and when and where and why to use them. And so when I think about live bait, I like to think about them in terms of profile first, the size of the live bait. I don't care as much about the type of the live bait. I care more about the size. And this is important because the fish actually need to fit it in their mouth, and you're trying to match whatever you're throwing at them. You're trying to match what they are naturally feeding on. And so each of these species are going to be different. They're going to range from different sizes, and so they're going to prefer different sizes of bait. So anything will eat something that's only the size of an inch, but that doesn't mean it's the best thing for them. And so let's go over these tiers. So 0 to 1 inches, anywhere in there, is going to be great for a panfish. And when I'm talking panfish, I'm not saying like wide arching. I'm saying more bluegill, sunfish, brim, red ears, these panfish that are all kind of in the sunfish family that are the size of your hand, they'll be best served between 0 and 1 inch. When I say 0, I don't mean don't put anything on there, but you can go very, very small for them and they'll feed on it. So 0 to 1 inch, right? And then with crappies, I like 1 to 2 inches of length. And that goes the same for perch. So I kind of bag crappie and perch together where I go for that 1 to 2 inches. For trout, I like to do 1 to 3 inches. For walleye, I'm thinking 2 to 4 inches, sometimes 5. And bass, I'm also thinking really anywhere between 3 inches and 10 inches, which is pretty crazy, but we'll get to that later. For northern pike and pickerel, chain pickerel, I like to stick around 4 to 7 inches. And for catfish, it's going to be a little bit tricky because the bait isn't typically going to be alive. It's going to be like a cut bait. I am thinking about chunks of bait that are typically like 2 to 3 inches wide and 2 to 3 inches long, like a big square chunk. And so those are kind of like the sizes, right? And so all of these baits can kind of fit into those categories. And so there are some that serve better in the smaller category, and there are some that serve better in the larger category. But when you're buying your live bait and then you're rigging it up, I want you to think about it in terms of the profile of the bait in relation to what the fish can actually eat. So if you go and you buy 5-inch shiner minnows, which are going to be great for a walleye, bass, and pike, it's not possible for a bluegill to eat that because it's half of its body size. It can't physically fit it in its mouth. But there are very small crappie minnows out there that are around 1 inch that a bluegill has no problem taking down. So think about that in terms of when you're picking out your live bait, because each one of these will work for a species. Some work better than others for a particular species, but if you get the sizing profile right, you're going to probably be fine. So let's break each of these live baits down because some of them work in those profiles better than others, and some of them just naturally are more appealing to some fish species than others. Worms are a great place to start. I really, really like worms because they're super flexible in terms of size. And so, for example, there are 2 types of worms that are most common. Those are going to be night crawlers, and then those are going to be red worms. Those are the 2. Right now, red worms are going to be called a bunch of different things. Compost worms, trout worms. Just know that red worms are those kind of reddish worms that you see in your yard all the time or under rocks and things like that. They're not giant. They're typically anywhere between 2 to 4 inches. And night crawlers are those big ones that are kind of anywhere between 3 to 10 inches. They can get huge. And so what's great about worms is that they have a ton of hearts in them. I'm not a scientist. I don't know the exact biology of the worm, but I do know from all of my fishing experience that you can cut the worm down into smaller pieces and it stays alive. That part of the worm stays alive. So if you have a big 6-inch night crawler and you cut it down into 6 pieces, you're going to have 6 pieces of worm that are typically going to move around still. They're still going to be active, and that's important when you're fishing with live bait because the whole purpose of you getting that live bait out there is to present a lifelike bait attractant that the fish wants to bite. So worms are great because if you go to a body of water that you've never fished before and you don't know exactly what's on the table, you can start small and work your way up bigger when you see bigger opportunities. So you should be able to target panfish in any freshwater body of water that's holding fish. And you would cut down into about 1 inch or less of worm and you throw that on a hook under your clip bobber. You just throw it out and you should be catching fish. Well, you might catch a bass. And if you catch a bass, there's probably more bass. So how do you, kind of switch over and try to target these bigger bass? Well, put on a bigger worm. And so worms are great because, especially night crawlers, I really like night crawlers because they're so flexible in terms of the size profile. So if you wanted to catch a big bass or catch a walleye or catch a pike, you can throw the whole worm on, and we'll talk a little bit about rigging in a bit. But you can throw the whole worm on and catch a bigger bass or a bigger walleye. Or you can slim it down and trim it down and then just kind of pitch those little quarter to full inch pieces and catch panfish, and then anything in between. All of these fish will eat worms. Every single fish in freshwater that is a common species will eat worms. So then you say, hey, Ed, well, if all of the fish eat worms and will eat worms, why would I use anything else? The only downside with worms is that they're so good for crappie and panfish, especially sunfish, that you're going to have a real tough time targeting larger fish with them. And so let's say that you increased the profile and you used the whole worm and you casted that out and you're really trying to catch a bass. While it's a little too big for the panfish to actually get on because you're using a bigger hook and you're using a bigger worm, they'll slowly just hammer away at it and you'll be left with no worm. They'll start at the tail ends. They'll start pinching down on it. They'll start pulling on it. And then all of a sudden, all of these smaller species are going to basically decimate your worm. And so unless you're in a deep enough situation for walleye or bass where they're kind of the dominant species in the area that you've chosen, you're basically going to get your worms wiped out by smaller fish. Now, that's not a problem if you're going for smaller fish. That's great. That's fantastic. But if you're trying to get something a little bit bigger, it's going to be hard, especially if you're fishing off of the shore, because that area along the shoreline is super diverse. And so whenever you're fishing a really diverse area of the water body that you're fishing, there's typically going to be a bunch of different species, including the smaller species. And if you're using worms, the smaller fish will hit that worm regardless of the size, but you won't actually catch them because they can't fit their mouths on that bigger hook. And they're just going to decimate your worm. And then you're going to be left with nothing, and you're going to cast and throw it out again. And you're going to be like, what am I doing? So how do you get around that? That's where you're thinking about leeches and minnows. And so if you use a really small leech, and let's go just to leeches right now. Leeches come in a variety of sizes. And so unlike worms, there's not going to be like a bunch of different types of leeches. They're just going to be purchased at different sizes. So there's like an extra small, medium, large, and jumbo. And you know, I wouldn't put a specific unit of measurement on those categories because it's Bubba at the bait shop that's picking out which ones go where. But in general, you should be thinking that like the smaller leeches should be around an inch to an inch and a half when fully extended. And then jumbos should get up to about 7 inches when fully extended. And when I say fully extended, you'll see with the leeches, they like kind of push up into like an oval shape when they condense. And then when they expand, when they're in water and they're swimming around, they can expand really greatly and they move like a wave. So with leeches, they're a little bit tougher than worms. It's tough for those panfish to go in and pick them apart. Because worms, the beauty with worms, because you can easily pinch them down into smaller sizes, fish can easily bite them off into smaller sizes, whereas leeches, that's really hard to do. Their skin's a lot tougher. And so while a leech can get peppered by smaller fish, they typically won't be able to completely remove the leech. They'll either have to totally commit to the leech, or, you know, if it's a bigger fish, they'll take a bite and maybe miss. But in reality, if you're using leeches, they're typically not going to get peppered as much as a worm will. And so you can still use leeches for panfish for these smaller species. You just use the small to mediums. Extra small is great too. But the leeches are ideal for those medium fish, where if you're really trying to target crappie, or you're trying to target a really big bluegill, or especially walleye, leeches are very effective for walleyes. This is kind of your go-to because it'll allow you to target those species without getting totally ransacked by sunfish in the water body. And so that's where leeches kind of fit. So if you're thinking about this, like in terms of everything that we're talking about, worms can go all over the place, but they're typically best for the smallest species. Leeches are pretty good for the middle-sized species, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about minnows right now. Minnows are typically used for larger species. Now, that's a blanket statement. There are small minnows that you can buy out there that'll work for panfish and crappie. I mean, there's a minnow out there named a crappie minnow. It's perfect for crappie. But when you're thinking about minnows, I would say that minnows are used to weed through all of the smaller fish. It's really tough for really small bluegills and really small sunfish to take down a 2 to 3 inch crappie minnow. It's not to say that they can't do it, but it's going to be a less common occurrence than if you go and put a little pinch of worm on. You're gonna catch panfish all day. So when we're talking about minnows, there's a couple different types of minnows that are really common in freshwater. Those are going to be the smaller version, which are crappies that are around 2 to 3 inches. And so just so you don't get confused, crappies are a fish, and then crappie minnows are a totally different species. It's just that crappies prefer them. That's where they get their name. I'm sure they have a scientific name. But crappie minnows are just small minnows. Then you've got fatheads, which are kind of in a little bit bigger than crappie minnows, but they're around the same size. Then you've got shiner minnows, which are in that kind of 3 to 6 inch size. And then you've got sucker minnows, which can be anywhere from 4 inches to like 12 inches. But most of the time you're looking at that 4 to 8 inch size in a sucker minnow. So those are the general freshwater minnows. Now, every region has its own. I'm sure that you'll go to some places and they'll have shad, or they'll have some thing that I'm not mentioning here. I know rainbows. They're not rainbow trout, but they're like rainbow minnows that look kind of like a rainbow, or like golden stuff. There's a bunch. I've seen a bunch of different minnows that are all over the place. Going back to it, it's really not about the species. It's about the profile and the size. So when we are thinking about minnows, you're typically using minnows to catch those larger species. So most of the time when you buy a minnow, it's going to be somewhere between that 3 to 6 inch size. So, larger crappie minnows, larger fathead minnows, and typical shiner sizes, as well as just regular sized suckers. They're all in that kind of like 3 to 5, 3 to 6 inch range. And those are going to be great for walleye and bass and pike. And so again, you can catch trout and panfish and crappie on smaller crappie minnows that are, 2 inches to 3 inches. But when you're conceptualizing it, minnows are going to be used for larger fish species. So we've got the overview of what baits we are talking about: minnows, leeches, and worms. Some things that I didn't mention here are crickets and wax worms. Now, those are kind of a little bit more specialty. Those are for focusing on panfish as well as trout in some circumstances. Just use a worm for now, like a pinch of nightcrawler or half of red worm when you're focusing on these species, because wax worms and crickets are a little bit harder to get your hands on, and I want to kind of give you a universal, accessible approach to live bait. And we'll have episodes on more specialized live bait at a later date. And I don't want you to get disheartened when I'm like specialized, because your area might be like, hey, this is what we've got. Crickets and waxworms, you can use those under these different rigs that I'm going to talk about. Just make sure you use very small hooks, somewhere in the like number 6 to number 8 range. I know in our trout kit, we've got number 8s, and then in most of our kits, we've got number 6s. So just keep that in mind. You're going to have to slim your hooks down. Talking about hooks, let's get into the rigging, how we are going to rig up all of these things. And the hook sizes, and how we are going to be kind of thinking about this, as well as adjusting our setups accordingly. So the main rigging that I want to talk about is a slip bobber. And if you take anything away from this podcast in terms of using live bait, please take away the live bait slip bobber. Now, the slip bobber is like my go-to to present a multitude of live bait. I think that it is the most versatile and flexible way to present live bait, and you can present minnows, leeches, and worms under this, and you can present any size under this. You just have to adjust the hook size. And so what a slip bobber does is it allows you to float a bait at a certain depth in the water column, and that could be as deep as 100 feet down. It could be as deep as 3 feet. And this is why slip bobbers are so important, is that I know you've gone through the beginner stage of using a clip bobber, and I'm sure you've noticed that when you clip that bobber on, you're pretty much limited. So you could have, your hook and your sinker and your clip bobber and your bait, but you can only put the clip bobber like a maximum of 5 feet up from the hook, because you still have to cast it, and the clip bobber is fixed to your line. So if you reeled it up to try to cast, you really, it's almost impossible to get it deeper than 5 feet, because you can't cast appropriately. It's getting stopped on your rod tip, right? So this is why a slip bobber is so important, is that it allows you to set the depth. So you'll be able to reel in any slack line and cast it out consistently with your bobber, 1 to maybe 2 feet above your hook, and you'll be able to cast it out into 20 feet of water, and it'll get your bait down to 20 feet of water because of the mechanics of the slip bobber. So let's talk a little bit about the mechanics. So a similar rig, you're basically going to use a hook, a weight, a slip bobber, and then there's 2 new things that we're introducing here. It's a bobber stop bead and a bobber stopper. And so the bobber stopper, also known as a slip tie, is a tie that you thread onto your line. They come pre-arranged, so you don't have to learn how to tie a slip tie knot. And you can essentially adjust this knot anywhere on your line, and it'll stop the bobber at that section. So this is super important because you can move it up, and it's so slender on your line that you can reel up all the slack. The slip tie can sit in your spool somewhere deep in your spool, and you can still cast. It's not a big deal. So let's walk through kind of how we would rig this up. Again, I wanted to say for the millionth time, go and check out our fishing resources library. We've got all of these free ebooks to download. It's tailoredtackle.com. And then if you go to the fishing resources section, you can click on the fishing library and you can download our freshwater fishing quick guide. It's an ebook that'll show you diagrams of all of these rigs that I'm talking about. And so let me kind of just walk you through it, especially if you own a slip bobber setup already. We have them in our freshwater kit, our trout kit, our walleye kit, which are kind of the main species. The freshwater kit covers, everything in freshwater, but basically it's just like a very common setup. It's not a very common setup for bass, but that doesn't mean you can't catch bass on this. And so let's kind of walk through it. Basically, first you take your line out and you've got a slip tie, this stopper, right? It comes in a little tube, and the tie's on the outside, and you slide this tube up on your line, and then you shimmy the tie up off of the tube onto your line, and then you just pull the tag ends, and then it'll just cinch right down on your line. Don't go too tight, because then you can't move it around. You need it just tight enough to move it up and down the line without having it too loose so that it doesn't stick to your depth. So you'll feel it out. You'll know what I'm talking about when you tie it, and you're going to see if your thing moves around too loosey or it's too tight and you can't move it. You just have to put on a new one. So you put that tie on first. You threaded it up maybe a foot or two, and then you wiggle it off the tube and you cinch it down on the line. And then what you're going to do is you're going to add a slip bead. Again, like all slip bobber slip ties should come in a package with these beads. All of this is included in our kits, but they should generally, if you bought them individually, if you buy slip ties individually, they should come with the beads. And so you thread on this bead next, and then you thread on your bobber. And so the bobber, this is the great thing about a slip bobber, is that the line goes straight through it vertically. So then the bobber moves up and down on the line. And this bead catches the top of the bobber, which sticks to the slip tie so that it stops your bobber, and you can move the slip tie anywhere on your line, and that's where the bobber's going to stop. Underneath the bobber, I like to put a split shot. It doesn't have to be super heavy. It can be anywhere from like a smaller size to a larger size, just not too large to sink the bobber. And, a typical bobber is going to handle all traditional sizes of split shots. So you put your split shot weight on right underneath the bobber, and you leave about a foot or two of line to tie onto your hook. Now, this separation is important. Like, you're going to want to keep your split shot about a foot or two up above your hook, because that keeps your bobber from going all the way down to your hook and messing with the live bait. It also keeps live bait from going too crazy. And so this is another concept that you've got to keep in mind, is that live bait, especially minnows, are a meal, and you're trying your best to present kind of a trapped or wounded meal. If you've ever watched fish in an aquarium or, just on the shoreline and there's a bunch of minnows around, you might be surprised that they're coexisting, where this, school of minnows is just sitting there, and you got a big pike there and nobody's doing anything. The pike's not eating the minnows. And that's because it takes a lot of energy for a fish to go and attack a very lively minnow, a regular minnow that's swimming around. And so they typically like to save their energy for an easy catch. They really, really like a minnow that's alive, but it's wounded or it's kind of fallen back from the pack. If you ever watch any nature documentary, you're going to see this with mammals too. Most of the time, the lions and tigers are going to go for either the youngest, most vulnerable species or vulnerable animal in the species group that they're targeting as prey, or they're going to target the most sickly / wounded one. And that goes the same for predators and fish. So what you're really trying to do is mimic something that is alive, but something that is struggling. And if you allow it to drift too far from the weight, so let's say you didn't put a weight on at all and you just put on a hook, your bobber is going to kind of mess with the hook and it's going to mess with the live bait presentation. But worse, your minnow could really be alive. If you buy a really fresh minnow, what can happen is that minnow's moving around like crazy, and then you go and you throw it in there and it's not necessarily wounded or debilitated enough to entice a fish. So I've seen it on underwater cameras when I study fish and things like that. If you have too lively of a minnow, you're going to watch fish come up, they're interested, but then they just kind of swim off because they're like, oh, that's going to take too much energy. I'm going to have to like run around and try to catch this minnow. And I know from all of the times that I've tried to catch regular minnows before, it's really hard. So they like to wait until something's kind of struggling and then they expend their energy. So the weight is important, not only just for the rig to work, but that concept of kind of presenting something that's wounded or struggling or unhealthy is very important. So you've got your hook, you've got your split shot about a foot up from that, you've got your slip bobber, you have your bobber bead and your tie. And that's the slip bobber rig setup. Now, the last kind of important thing when it comes to the slip bobber is what bait you're putting on it. So I don't really want you to pick your hooks according to the size of the fish. I want you to pick your hooks according to the size of the bait, because you're trying to present the bait with the least amount of hook showing possible, but still a large enough hook to get a good hook set on your fish, right? And so if you were to just like put the smallest hook you could think of, like a number 12 or a number 14 on your line, because you're like, oh, well, the fish can't even see it, and I'm going to put this bait on. The problem with that, the reason why we have larger hooks than that is the gap between the hook point and the shaft of the hook is too small to actually stick into most fish species. And so you need to have enough space. It's the gap between the hook point and the shaft of the hook to actually set the hook in the fish's mouth. But you also want it tight enough and small enough so that it conceals your bait to a better degree so that your bait is more appealing. And so here's kind of like a rule of thumb that I like to kind of go by is that number 6 hooks are great for smaller minnows and leeches as well as worms. And then number 1s or number 2s are great for minnows. And so all of our kits kind of hold those hooks in them, like a mixture of them. And so if you're like, I don't understand hook sizes and I don't want to think about all of this stuff, you can buy our kit or, other people's advice, I guess. Nobody else really does this where they put like the right hook sizes and the right quantities in each kit. Little humble brag there, but it's true. It's just why I started making them that way, because it's hard to figure out. But if you want to start buying things individually, just know that like in freshwater, I really like number 6s for small minnows, leeches, and bits of worm. And then I really like number 1s to number 2s for live minnows that are larger in that 4 to 6 inch range. Also, the style of the hook is somewhat important. I really like bait holder hooks when I'm using worms. That's because what bait holder hooks have is they have barbs on the back of their shaft up above by the eyelet of the hook. And this is super helpful because it cinches the worm on. So if you were to throw kind of like a bit of worm on there and you move it up and you've got half of it up on the top of the shaft by the eyelet and the other half on the point of the hook, if you have a bait holder hook, it'll cinch that worm down towards the top and it'll cover up a lot of the hook so that the fish can't see it. And then because a bait holder will have kind of like a longer shaft, which is important because you got to put a lot of worm on there. And then for leeches and minnows, I really like octopus hooks. These are shorter shaft hooks because you're typically going to thread the minnow either through the back or through the front nose, or you're just going to thread the leech in once right below the sucker on the top of it. And so you're leaving a lot of hook shaft open, and you kind of have to because you want to keep these leeches and minnows alive. You don't want to be doubling up on them because it's going to kill them. You want them still alive. And so it's better to have a smaller shanked hook that's lower than a bait holder, so that there's not so much hook exposed that it gives away your presentation. The other option, especially when you get really up big into, a bigger sucker minnow or a bigger shiner, anything in that kind of like 5-inch to 8-inch range, especially when you're going for like big bass or big pike or muskies or something like that. I really like a 2-aught, a 1-aught to 2-aught circle hook. These are really good to give like a big wide gap for those bigger fish, but they also still have kind of like a shorter shank, not as short as an octopus hook, but still a helpful short shank. And you can thread these minnows on them just like you would an octopus hook through the lips of the minnow or through the back end by the tail. And it'll just give you a wider gap to set the hook on these bigger fish. And circle hooks are really well known for an ease of hook sets and ease of release. There's a bunch of science behind why that is. And when we have our hooks episode, I'll really cover it in depth. But so just like as a recap, just know, okay, I'm going to use a bait holder hook for my worms. I'm going to use an octopus hook for my leeches and let's say 2 to 4-inch minnows. And then for like my 4 to 8-inch, it's hard to say because like different minnows have different profiles, but let's just say like bigger minnows 4 to 8 inches, you should probably use a circle hook.
So that's the layout of the hooks. The beauty of the slip bobber and why I like it so much is you can put any hook you want underneath it, and you can present this bait at any depth. And so going back to this slip bobber approach, I can have my slip bobber rig all tied up, and then when I want to fish worms, I throw on my bait holder hook at the end of it. Or if I want to fish leeches, I throw that on. Or if I want to, fish a bigger minnow, I can do my octopus hook. And so, or not my octopus hook, my circle hook. So that's why I love this slip bobber float, is that it is super versatile. And while there is some time up front to get the rig all put on, once you have it on, you can switch your hook and switch your bait to anything. And then you can switch your depth to anything. So let's say that you wanted to fish for panfish today and they're in 3 to 5 feet of water. You can throw on kind of a small number 6-inch bait or number 6 bait holder hook, and you can set your bobber stop to a couple feet up from the hook. You can throw on a little, inch length piece of worm. You can toss it out and you're fishing for panfish. And then all of a sudden, you're like, you know what, let's try to get after a bass. Let me throw on a 3-inch crappie minnow. And I think the bass are going to be somewhere between 7 to 10 feet. Well, all of a sudden you just switch your bait holder hook to your octopus hook, under the same slip float, because you've got a foot of tag end between the split shot and your line, and you can move that up. It's infinite, right? And then you just change your depth on your slip bobber to a couple more feet up. Let's put it at 6 to 7 feet. And then you reel in, your slip tie just goes into your spool. You've got, 2 to 3 feet of line at the end of your line to cast it back out. And you're casting it right out into that 7 to 10 feet. And all of a sudden, boom, you've got a better live bait profile, the correct one for that species with the correct hook. You're fishing it at the right depth. And you switched all that up like 5 minutes ago. So that's why I love the slip bobber whenever I'm in freshwater. So I maintain multiple rods and reels. I'm not saying you have to do this, especially as a beginner, but as an expert, quote unquote, I like to keep multiple rods and reels with me, whether I'm in a boat or on a dock or fishing from shore. And I always have a slip float tied up somewhere. Because they're just so versatile. When I see an opportunity for live bait, that's my go-to.
Let's talk about how to present the slip float. Now, what I like to do is I like to set my slip float depth to around 1 foot off the bottom if it's like a rocky or muddy sandy bottom without weeds. And then if it's weedy, I like to get about a foot or 2 up above the weeds. Traditionally, you should be targeting like the areas around the weed edges and the weed line so that you can still hold it closer to the bottom. But you don't always have that opportunity. So the concept here is that the strike zone for fish to be feeding is typically 1 to 3 feet off the bottom on average. And so we'll get way deep into why that is. For now, when you're just getting started, let's just set it up to that depth, and you can move it around and see what works. But I think that 80% of your fish are going to get caught on that like 1 foot off the bottom to 3 foot max. And what's really great about that too, when it's not stuck on the bottom and it's held there, the wind will push your bobber around at a consistent rate. It won't go super far or super fast, but if it is windy or there's a little bit of a chop, that's actually good because it'll allow your bait to get presented in a bunch of areas. It'll actually do the work of pushing your bait around for you. So it'll get to different spots within the location that you're fishing. And your bait will be kind of like erratically moving on the hook. So, the bait won't necessarily, and it shouldn't be moving your entire rig around. Sometimes you'll get a pretty lively minnow. You might be using a minnow that's too big for the size of your bobber if it's like shooting around or bringing the bobber down. But you want that bobber to be just like kind of holding straight up and getting pushed around by the wind so that you cover more water. Now, anywhere between like less than 15 feet So like 5 to 15 feet is traditionally what you're going to fish off of from shore. And you can pretty easily guesstimate what the depth is. And you just kind of move your slip float as is, your slip tie. But when you're on a boat or a kayak or a deeper dock and the depth could be anywhere greater than 15 feet, it's really nice to have a clip weight. It's like it's called a depth finder. I don't want you to get confused by that because depth finder is used for electronic depth finders as well. But it's a little clip with a lead head on the bottom of it, and you clip that onto your hook and it'll bring your bobber down. It'll weight your bobber down, and you can move your slip tie accordingly so you can get exactly 1 to 3 feet off of the bottom. You can also do this much more slowly by just adding a couple more split shots to test out how deep it is, and move your slip accordingly. It's just easier. I think our walleye kit comes with a depth finder weight, which makes things a bit easier, but you don't have to worry about it too much, especially if you're fishing from shore or off of a dock. It's just very helpful to get an accurate reading when you're on a boat. So after you kind of get that out, what I would recommend is waiting at least 2 to 3 seconds for your bobber to be fully submerged before you set the hook. Now, when you're fishing for smaller fish, it could bob back and forth or move erratically. If it moves erratically for more than 5 seconds and you're fishing for something like panfish, then you can set the hook. A lot of times they'll be too small to fully submerge your setup. But yeah, that's kind of the general cadence. Moving on to some other live bait approaches, I would say that 50% of the time I'm using a slip float. And then I also switch over to these other two methods that I don't think are as critical. They're more situation specific. But I think jigging live bait is very helpful, especially if you're in deeper water and you're trying to fish for something a little bit more aggressive. So if you have an aggressive walleye bite, or you're trying to catch a bass, or you're trying to kind of get a pike going a little crazy, I like to jig minnows and leeches on a live bait jig head. And a live bait jig head, a lot of times they're called fireball jig heads. These jig heads have a shorter shank, so it allows you to kind of clip on, basically thread your minnow through the nose or thread your leech right below the sucker, and there's not that huge hook shank that you see on regular jigs. So what I'm talking about is when you have a regular jig head and it's got a little harness on the bottom of it to put your soft plastic on. So those jig heads are typically used for creature baits and curltail grubs and all sorts of soft plastics, and they hold the soft plastic on all the way up from the hook shank. These are the classic jigs that you always see. Those are not the ones you want to be using for live bait, because your live bait is just going to be threaded on the gap of the hook on the bottom, and then you've got all of this extra hook left over. And so it's really nice to have our live bait jigs, which are shorter. They're a shorter hook shank. They basically just go down to where that octopus hook would be, and it conceals the hook shaft a lot better. So it's a better presentation for the live bait. You don't just have this big honking jig on there with this big honking hook, and then there's just a minnow just barely pierced onto it. It slenders the profile a bit. We have live bait jigs in our freshwater kit and our walleye kit. But yeah, you can find them in most tackle shops. They're usually called fireball jigs or live bait jigs. And so with this approach, I don't like to jig worms. You definitely can. But worms aren't typically moving as fast as minnows and leeches do. And so it's more of a matching the bait and the natural presentation. You're bouncing this along the bottom and you're moving it a little bit quicker to give it that lifelike action. It's not just kind of floating around and the bait's kind of moving on its own on the hook. You're giving it a lot of the presentation and you're moving it pretty fast. So that's why it doesn't work great with worms. It'll still work. But if you wanted to optimize it the most, it works best with minnows and leeches. And so this is great for areas that aren't weedy, because if you're jigging off the bottom, you're going to just pick up a bunch of weeds. And so I would use a slip float when I'm fishing a weedier area. But if I'm fishing deeper, this is really good for like if you're on a boat or a kayak or you're pitching out on a deeper drop off. Anything that's not going to have that consistent depth, because what you don't want to do is toss a slip bobber float with your minnow on it, and in 5 or 6 seconds it floats from 1 foot off the bottom to 5 feet off the bottom because you had a depth transition from 15 to 20 feet. If you know that you're fishing over like a drop off or a point or whatever, and there's severe changes in depth, a slip bobber might not be the best approach. And if you wanted to fish fast and more aggressively, then the jig is really what you want to be doing. And so, yeah, it's pretty straightforward. You're kind of casting it out. And you're retrieving it. And so you're bouncing it along the bottom on the way back. And I like to give it longer pauses. So they're going to feed off of it when it hits the ground. And that pause, that like maybe 3 to 4 second pause where it's on the ground is typically where they're going to hit it. You can retrieve it faster and swim it off the bottom or swim it in the middle of the water column. That'll get more pike. But if you're kind of just trying to pick up whatever species is feeding around the bottom, that's typically going to be walleye and bass. So this is a really good presentation for walleye and smallmouth bass. And you're fishing in rocky areas or a muddy area or a sandy area. This is kind of a really good aggressive method to do it. And then the last kind of one that I want to talk about is I like to call it the poor man's live bait. And this is kind of what I grew up doing as a child before I kind of figured out how to use a slip float. And we maybe didn't have the best jigs. We lacked a lot of equipment. And so this is pretty simple. You basically take an octopus hook or a bait holder hook, and that can be with your worm, your minnow, your leech. And then you just put a split shot sinker about a foot up above it. And you kind of can do two things. You put a heavier one on and you just kind of drag the live bait along the bottom. So you cast it out, you let it sink down, and you just reel it really slowly. And this kind of shows like a bait fish or a leech or a worm that's kind of gradually and naturally working along the bottom. And then if you wanted to go kind of for bass or pike, those ones that are kind of feeding in the middle of the water column, typically, you'd put on a really light split shot with a bigger minnow, worm, or leech, and you gradually reel it back as well, and it's going to stay up a little bit higher as you retrieve it. But the name of the game here is to just slowly retrieve it and then let it sit, slowly retrieve it and let it sit. So there's not a lot of material involved. This is really, really good for like small streams and rivers for trout. I love to do this with a worm. And if you're just fishing off of a dock, like it's not rocket science. It's about the most basic thing that you can do. It's super easy. It definitely can get kids on fish. It's not the most aggressive. It's not the most optimized, but it'll work in a pinch, and it's pretty straightforward. So when the fish are pretty lethargic and I don't want to mess around with a slip float, it's just an easy way to just get live bait out there and cast it in. And you want to add that split shot, because if you're just casting live bait on a hook, it typically doesn't have enough weight to get the distance out. So you'll see the common theme in here with all of these live bait approaches is that they're weighted. So there's a split shot sinker underneath your slip float. That keeps the slip float from going down onto the hook, but it also just gives you that weight to get your bait out farther and to keep the bobber straight when it's got pressure against it, when it's pressured against the slip tie. And then the jig is weighted, so you can cast it out and bounce it along the bottom. And then this other approach is weighting. Just a simple split shot with a hook is just weighting it so you can actually cast it out, because the live bait on a hook will just be too light. Now, I say that, but this is the last thing, and it's just called freelining. It works a lot in saltwater. I use it a lot in saltwater, but it's just taking a hook and throwing live bait on and just letting it drift around out there. what I like to do with that is when I want to fish and float something with a lot of current, especially a river or stream, I'll be up on the headwaters of it. I mean, just like farther up on the current, and I'll pitch a little piece of live bait, whether that's a minnow, leech, or worm, and I'll just let it drift and float around like it fell off of a tree or like it got wounded and the current's going to take it down. If you don't have current or you don't have waves, that's why this works really well in salt water and rivers and streams. This probably isn't a good move. But yeah, if the fish are super finicky and are being real slow, you can do this. And I would encourage you to try a bunch of these different things. I would prioritize the slip float. I think my next approach would be the jig, and then the last approach would be the weighted hook. The split shot up about a foot from the hook and just casting it out, because you can adjust that weight and get better casts with it. And then the last one is just freelining. And freelining, again, you're kind of reverting to freelining because you're taking advantage of a current or a surf to push your bait around in a natural way. But most of you won't have that opportunity because you're typically going to be fishing in a pond or a lake, and you won't be able to get your bait out far enough. So that is my beginner outlook on live bait fishing. I know I covered a lot here. Again, like if you are looking for this gear, we have everything I've been talking about in our freshwater kit, and then more specialized versions of it in the walleye and the trout kit. The bass kit doesn't really focus on this very much because you should be using mostly artificials for bass. That's not to say you will not catch bass on live bait. You definitely will. It's just not the core focus for most of the techniques and tactics used in bass fishing. Again, my big takeaway here is that if you want to go out and catch fish and you are not super worried about which species, and you're not really worried about focusing on a bigger or smaller size, you just want to catch a lot of fish and you don't really care which one it is, I would always default to live bait. And if you are struggling, especially with learning a lot of the different artificials, and you're having a couple trips that didn't really work out, I highly recommend just pitching some live bait out there, getting the juices flowing, getting a couple fish on the boat, work your confidence back up, and just enjoy catching fish with some live bait. Lastly, if a lot of this didn't make sense in terms of all of the parts that I'm talking about, and even some of the techniques, I encourage you to go to our website, tailoredtackle.com, and go to our resource section, where there is a library section where you can download all of our free ebooks, and it has all of the diagrams and graphics that explain all of the stuff that I'm talking about here. So thank you so much for listening. We are either going to come out with an advanced episode next, or I might do an interview with an expert. So have a great day. Good luck out there, and tight lines.